My name is Jack, and I have learned that there is a specific kind of silence that only exists when you are completely alone during the holidays, the kind that presses in on you from every corner of the house and makes even familiar rooms feel like places you are trespassing in. And that silence began for me last December when my girlfriend packed her bags and left to stay with her parents for the holidays while I stayed behind because work wouldn't allow me to leave town, and I told myself I was fine with it, that I would enjoy the peace, the quiet, the space, especially because I live in a small upstate New York town where Christmas turns entire neighborhoods into ghost streets as families disappear to be with relatives. And by the second day nearly every house on my block was dark, their driveways empty, snow undisturbed, curtains drawn like closed eyes. And I remember standing at my front window the first evening watching the streetlights glow against the fresh snowfall and thinking how peaceful it all looked, how calm, how still, and convincing myself that this was exactly what I needed, a break from noise and responsibility, a chance to slow down. But peace has a way of curdling into something else when it lingers too long, and I didn't realize how unused I was to being truly alone until the house began to sound wrong, until the normal creaks and pops felt louder, sharper, like signals instead of background noise, and on my second night alone, when darkness fell. Early at around 6:30 and the snow had been falling all day in light steady sheets that muffled the world outside, I was standing in my kitchen making a simple dinner, pasta and chicken because I'm not much of a cook and my girlfriend usually handles that part of our lives, and I had the television on in the background not because I was watching it but because I needed something to occupy the air, something human, something familiar, and while I was sitting at the table eating, fork halfway to my mouth, I heard a sound that didn't belong, something thin and wavering that took a moment for my brain to recognize, and I remember thinking at first that it was part of the show, maybe a commercial or background music, until it continued at the same volume and same cadence, and when I muted the TV the sound didn't disappear, it became clearer, closer, unmistakable. Someone was singing outside my house, and not just humming or mumbling but singing a full song in a slow, uneven voice that drifted through the cold air, and when I realized the words were Jingle Bells I almost laughed under my breath because it felt absurd, because who sings Christmas carols alone? And yet the laughter died before it reached my throat because the voice wasn't cheerful, it wasn't playful, it wasn't drunk or joking, it was flat and off-key and strangely focused, like someone reciting something they had memorized without understanding why. And I stood up from the table and walked toward the front door, each step making the singing louder, clearer, until by the time I reached the door it sounded like the man was standing directly on my porch, and I felt a tight knot form in my stomach, that instinctive warning that kicks in before logic has time to argue. But I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a caroler, maybe some strange local tradition I didn't know about, and when I opened the door the cold air rushed in and there he was, standing in the yellow glow of my porch light. A man who looked to be in his mid-30s, average height, average build, wearing a thin coat that didn't look warm enough for the weather and no hat despite the snow. And the strangest thing was that he didn't react to me at all, didn't pause, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge that a door had just opened inches from his face. He just kept singing, eyes locked on my welcome mat like it held something only he could see. And I remember forcing a smile because I didn't know what else to do. Because this situation didn't fit into any social script I had ever learned, and I stood there listening to him finish the song, expecting him to say something when he was done, to ask for donations or wish me a Merry Christmas or even just walk away. But instead he took a breath and started singing Jingle Bells again from the beginning in the exact same slow, uneven tone, and this time his eyes lifted and met mine. And something about that eye contact made my smile collapse because there was no warmth there. No recognition, no embarrassment, just focus, like I was another object he had included in the performance, and I stood there pretending to listen, telling myself it would end any second, that surely no one sings the same song more than twice on a stranger's porch, but the seconds stretched into minutes, and he kept looping the song, verse after verse, never speeding up, never slowing down, never missing a word. And when I finally checked my phone I realized nearly 4 minutes had passed, and my discomfort had hardened into something sharper, something that made the inside of my chest feel tight, and I finally interrupted him, thanking him politely and closing the door slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you don't want to provoke someone, and for a brief moment I thought that was it, that the social cue had been delivered and received, but the singing continued uninterrupted through the door, the same volume, the same rhythm, as if the door hadn't closed at all. And I walked back to the table and tried to eat, tried to focus on the food, but the sound followed me through the house, filling the rooms, seeping into corners, making it impossible to think about anything else, and the longer it went on the more aware I became of how abnormal it was, of how no normal person stands outside a stranger's house in the snow singing the same song over and over again, and I wondered if he was mentally ill, if someone else was with him, watching from the street, if this was some kind of prank. But when I glanced out the window there was no one else, no cars, no movement, just him and the falling snow, and after what felt like an eternity but was probably around 10 minutes, the singing stopped so suddenly that it made me flinch, the silence crashing down heavier than the noise had been, and I stood up slowly and approached the front door again, peering through the glass, expecting to see an empty porch, expecting relief, but instead I saw him standing at the end of my driveway, no longer singing, no longer moving, just facing my house, perfectly still, as if he had repositioned himself deliberately, like this was the next phase of whatever this was, and something about that stillness felt far worse than the singing, because it felt intentional, because it felt like waiting, and I cracked the door and told him he couldn't be there, that this was private property and he needed to leave, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it firm, and he didn't respond, didn't react, didn't blink, and when I threatened to call the police and close the door again I stood at the window watching him, hoping to see him turn away, hoping the threat would be enough, but he stayed where he was, unmoving, and I didn't call the police then because I didn't want to escalate things, because part of me still believed this could be explained, that there was a harmless reason behind it all, and instead I went upstairs, locked my bedroom door, checked the window, and when I saw that he was finally gone from the driveway I felt a rush of relief so strong it made my knees weak, convinced myself it was over, changed into bed clothes, and climbed into bed with a book, unaware that the worst part of the night hadn't even begun yet. I didn't sleep that night in any meaningful sense of the word, because sleep requires surrender and I couldn't bring myself to let go of awareness after what had happened. So I lay there in the dark listening to the house breathe and settle and groan under the weight of winter, every small sound turning sharp and threatening in my mind. And when morning finally came it felt less like relief and more like exhaustion winning a temporary ceasefire, pale gray light leaking through the curtains, the street outside still empty, still silent, and I told myself over and over that the man was gone, that the singing was over, that whatever strange encounter I'd had was finished, but the feeling he left behind lingered like a smell you can't wash out of fabric, and as I went through the motions of the day, showering, making coffee, answering emails, I kept catching myself listening for something, expecting to hear that off-key melody drifting through the walls again, and it never came, which somehow made things worse, because it meant my mind had room to replay the memory in detail, the way he hadn't acknowledged me, the way his eyes had met mine without recognition, the way he'd stood at the end of my driveway like a marker instead of a man, and by mid-afternoon the isolation started to press in on me again, the snow still falling, the world outside still muffled and distant, and I realized that staying inside the house all day was only feeding my anxiety, so I decided to leave, to drive somewhere familiar, somewhere lit and populated, to remind myself that the world was still normal beyond my quiet street, and I grabbed my keys and coat and stepped outside, locking the door behind me and scanning the street instinctively, half expecting to see him standing there again, but there was nothing, just snow and empty houses and the low hum of the wind, and the drive out of my neighborhood felt strangely tense, like I was leaving a place that had already marked me somehow. And as I reached the main road and headed toward town, the radio crackled with static, refusing to lock onto a station, and I turned it off because the noise grated on my nerves, choosing silence instead, which might have been a mistake, because silence leaves room for imagination. And about 15 minutes into the drive, as the trees thickened and the houses thinned, I noticed something ahead on the road that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel, a figure standing on the shoulder, facing away from traffic, motionless. and as I drew closer I saw that it was a man wearing a thin coat, no hat, standing far too still for the cold, and my first instinct was to keep driving, to tell myself that coincidences happen and that not every stranger is a threat. But when I passed him and glanced in my rearview mirror, my stomach dropped because he turned his head slowly to follow my car, and even from that distance I recognized the face, pale and slack, eyes too focused, and panic surged through me so fast it felt like vertigo, my foot pressing harder on the gas as my heart pounded, and I kept driving, telling myself it didn't mean anything, that maybe it wasn't him, that I was projecting fear onto a random stranger. But a few minutes later I saw another figure ahead, this one standing closer to the road, and then another, spaced out along the highway like mile markers, all facing away, all motionless, all dressed wrong for the weather, and the realization hit me in a slow, creeping wave that made my skin prickle. This wasn't coincidence, this was pattern, and the road felt suddenly narrower, the trees leaning in, the sky pressing down, and when I reached a small rest area I almost didn't pull in, but the need to stop, to breathe, to ground myself, overrode my fear, and I turned off the highway and parked beneath a flickering light, the engine ticking loudly in the sudden stillness, and as I sat there I noticed something that made my chest tighten again, a white cargo van parked at the far end of the lot, windowsless, engine idling, headlights off, and I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but my body didn't listen, my instincts screaming that this was wrong, and I stayed in the car for several minutes, watching, waiting for something to happen, and when nothing did I got out, moving quickly, eyes darting toward the van, toward the tree line, toward the bathrooms, and the air felt thick, heavy, like a storm about to break, and as I walked toward the restroom building I heard it again, faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, a familiar melody, and my blood ran cold because I knew what it was before my brain could fully process it. Jingle bells, sung slowly, unevenly, and I froze, scanning the area, trying to locate the source, and the singing grew louder, closer, echoing strangely off the concrete walls, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside at all. It was coming from inside the restroom building, and fear rooted me in place, my rational mind screaming that this couldn't be happening, that it made no sense, that the man couldn't be everywhere at once, but the sound was unmistakable, and when the restroom door creaked open from the inside and a figure stepped into the dim light I felt something inside me break, because it wasn't just him, it was two men, identical in posture, identical in dress, identical in that same vacant focus, singing in unison, their voices slightly out of sync, creating a dissonance that made my head throb, and I stumbled backward, heart racing, and as I did I saw movement near the van, more figures emerging from the shadows, more thin coats, more stillness, more eyes turning toward me at the same time, and in that moment I understood with horrifying clarity that whatever this was, it wasn't a single person. It wasn't even a group of people in the normal sense, it was something repeating itself, something copying a shape and wearing it badly, and I ran, adrenaline taking over completely, sprinting back to my car, fumbling with the keys, the singing rising behind me, swelling, multiplying, and when the engine finally roared to life I peeled out of the lot without looking back, tires slipping on the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the edge of town. Lights and traffic and people reappearing like a mirage, and only then did the singing fade, leaving behind a ringing silence and the sinking realization that I hadn't escaped them at all. I had only moved somewhere they were content not to follow yet, and as I sat in my car outside a brightly lit grocery store, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I knew with a certainty that terrified me more than anything else that this wasn't random. This wasn't over, and whatever had come to my house that night had chosen me for a reason I didn't yet understand. I stayed in town far longer than I needed to that evening, wandering the bright aisles of the grocery store with a basket I didn't intend to fill, lingering near other people like a man warming his hands at a fire he was afraid to leave, telling myself that nothing could happen here, that whatever I'd encountered belonged to empty roads and dark places and would dissolve under fluorescent lights and security cameras, and yet even there I felt watched, not in the obvious way where you catch someone staring, but in the subtle way that makes the back of your neck itch, like a tension without a source, and when I finally checked out and stepped back into the cold night air, I hesitated beside my car, scanning the lot, half expecting to see a thin-coated figure standing between vehicles, humming softly, but there was nothing, just shoppers loading bags and engines starting and the ordinary noise of life, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe that I'd overreacted, that fear and exhaustion had stitched a pattern where none existed, and I drove home under that fragile illusion, the radio on low, the road familiar and well lit at first, then gradually narrowing and darkening as I turned off toward my neighborhood. And the moment I crossed the invisible boundary where houses grew sparse again, that illusion began to crack, the air seeming heavier, the radio slipping back into static, and when I reached my street, my headlights swept over a sight that made my stomach drop, every house dark, every driveway empty, and at the far end of the block, directly beneath the streetlight, stood a figure motionless, facing my home, and my first instinct was to keep driving, to turn around and never come back, but something deeper, something stubborn and terrified and angry, made me pull into my driveway instead, because I didn't want to be chased, because I didn't want to live my life running from a shape in the dark. And as I stepped out of the car, the cold bit into my face and the quiet wrapped around me like a held breath, and the figure at the end of the street didn't move, didn't sing, didn't react, just stood there as if marking a boundary, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, checking the windows, drawing the curtains, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard from outside, and for a while nothing happened, the house settling into its usual nighttime noises, the silence deep and oppressive but unbroken, and I sat on the couch with the lights on, television playing to an empty room, telling myself that if something were going to happen it would have happened already, that maybe they couldn't cross into neighborhoods, that maybe roads were their territory, and just as that thought began to take root the singing started again, not outside this time but everywhere at once, drifting through the walls, seeping through the vents, rising from the floorboards. A dozen voices singing the same song slightly out of sync, creating a chorus that made my head spin and my chest tighten, and I stood up slowly, panic spreading through me in cold waves, because the sound wasn't directional, it didn't come from one place, it filled the house like fog, and when I rushed to the front window and peeked through a gap in the curtain my breath caught because the streetlight at the end of the block was surrounded by figures now. 5, 6, maybe more, all standing too. Still, all facing my house, and as I watched one of them lifted its head and smiled, a slow, careful movement that felt rehearsed, and in that moment I understood that they weren't trying to scare me away, they were waiting for something, waiting for me, and the singing stopped abruptly, plunging the house into silence so complete it felt unnatural, and then my doorbell rang, a single chime that echoed through the house like a gunshot, and I didn't move, couldn't move, my body locked between fight and flight, and the doorbell rang again, followed by a knock, slow and deliberate, and a voice called my name, my full name, spoken gently, almost kindly, and I felt a surge of cold terror because I knew with absolute certainty that I had never told that man my name, had never given him anything that could explain this, and the voice continued, asking me to open the door, telling me it was cold, telling me they just wanted to sing for me, and the words were wrong somehow, practiced, like lines learned phonetically, and I backed away from the door, shaking my head, whispering no to an empty room, and when I didn't respond the knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of something scratching softly at the doorframe, fingernails dragging slowly across wood, and then laughter, quiet and uneven, echoing from outside and inside at the same time, and I ran upstairs, locking myself in the bedroom, pressing my back against the door, and as I stood there listening to the house fill with movement, footsteps on stairs that weren't there, doors opening and closing on their own, voices murmuring fragments of songs and sentences, I realized that they were learning, adapting, testing boundaries, and the most terrifying thought of all settled into my mind with awful clarity. This wasn't an attack, it was an invitation, and whatever they were, whatever wore those faces and sang those songs, they didn't want to break into my life by force, they wanted me to let them in, to choose them. And as the night dragged on and the sounds grew closer to my bedroom door, I understood that staying meant surrender, and leaving might be the only chance I had left, even if the road itself was waiting for me. I didn't pack a bag or leave a note or do anything that would suggest intention, because intention implies planning and I had none left. Only the raw animal need to get away, and when the sounds outside my bedroom door finally receded into a tense, watchful quiet, I took it as the only opening I was going to get, easing the door open inch by inch, heart hammering so hard I was sure it would give me away, the hallway dark and still, the air smelling faintly of cold and something else I couldn't place, like old fabric left too long in a damp place, and I moved through the house silently, grabbing my keys from the table, my phone from the couch, not daring to look out the windows because I knew what I would see, and when I unlocked the front door and stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap, the street empty at first glance, the streetlight flickering, snow falling gently as if nothing in the world was wrong, and I crossed the driveway quickly, got into my car, locked the doors, and only then allowed myself to breathe, starting the engine and pulling away from the curb without turning on the headlights until I reached the end of the block, and as I did I saw them, standing where my car had been moments before, 3 of them, then more emerging from between houses, their movements smooth and unhurried, like they knew there was no rush, and I drove, faster than I should have, heart in my throat, the town dissolving into darkness behind me as the road opened up ahead, and for a while nothing happened, no figures on the shoulder, no singing, no movement at all, just the hum of the engine and the rush of air, and a fragile hope sparked in my chest that maybe this time was different, maybe they couldn't follow me if I didn't give them time, and that hope lasted until I saw the headlights ahead, stopped in the middle of the road, blocking my path, and I slammed on the brakes, tires screaming on ice, the car skidding to a stop a few yards away from a familiar white cargo van, and before I could react the doors opened, not just from the van but from the darkness around it, figures stepping into the beam of my headlights one by one, forming a loose circle, all facing me, all wearing that same thin coat, that same expressionless focus, and the singing began again, soft at first, then swelling, dozens of voices joining in perfect, horrible unison, and something inside me snapped, fear giving way to a kind of exhausted clarity, and I got out of the car despite every instinct screaming not to, my breath fogging in the cold as I stood there facing them, and the singing faltered, then stopped, all eyes turning toward me, and for the first time one of them spoke without singing, telling me they had been practicing, that they wanted to get it right, that they didn't want to scare me anymore, and the words landed wrong, empty, like a child reciting lines without understanding them, and I asked them what they wanted, my voice shaking, and the answer came from all of them at once, calm and certain. They wanted a place to stay, a place with walls and doors and warmth, a place to be seen, and in that moment I understood the truth that had been circling me since the first song on my porch. They weren't following me because I was special, they were following me because I was alone. Because an empty house during the holidays is like a beacon to things that don't belong anywhere. And they told me I could go if I let one of them come back with me. Just one, to learn to practice being right, and the offer hung in the air like poison. And I thought of my house, my quiet street, my girlfriend planning to come home in a few days, and I realized with sick clarity that saying yes wouldn't save me, it would only move the horror closer to someone else, and I shook my head, stepping backward, and the singing started again, louder, harsher, the circle tightening, and I ran, not toward my car but into the trees beside the road, branches tearing at my coat, the sound of their voices following me, never getting closer, never falling behind, just there, constant, and I don't remember how long I ran or where I ended up, only that at some point the singing stopped and the woods grew quiet, and when dawn came I was alone, miles from anywhere, frostbitten and exhausted, eventually found by a passing hiker who thought I was drunk or lost, and I let him believe that because the truth sounded insane even to me, and weeks have passed now, my girlfriend is back. The house is loud and warm again, and for the most part the world feels normal, but sometimes late at night when the streets are quiet and the snow falls just right, I hear it, faint and distant, a familiar melody drifting through the cold air, and I know that they're still out there, still practicing, still waiting for the next empty house, the next person who opens the door and listens just a little too long to the song.